Let's begin with a short prayer. Today is the day of the election, so let us just say a short prayer for God's guidance in the election and that peace will reign in the community no matter what the results are. We ask this in the name of Jesus our Lord. Okay, so in the 1800s, the movement that we had studied earlier as Romanticism had really pointed out the great differences that you find in cultures and languages and tradition. There are a lot of books today being written on the fact that a whole culture is formed by a language, so that when you speak a set language, a culture naturally flows from it. I'm thinking of that, having studied in French Canada, that one of the things about the French language is you don't speak of something without adjectives. Like, for instance, the word for a nun or a sister is sœur, but you always say bon sœur, the good sister, or the good priest, or something like that. You never do it without adjectives. And one of the things about the French culture is that it's all kinds of details in their culture and everything. I think that flows from the use of adjectives about stuff. But anyway, this became very, very well known at this time, and this led to another movement, which was called nationalism. And nationalism, understand here, had a lot to do with culture, so that if that movement were going on now, the people in California who spoke Spanish would feel more culturally related to Mexico than they would to us. The people in Canada who spoke French would feel more culturally related to France, and the ones who spoke English would feel culturally related to us. And so and countries, as you know, were not necessarily divided up according to language. In fact, that's one of the great problems in Africa, that when the nations in Africa were created, and they weren't created that long ago, African tribes are very much like Native American tribes. You had tribes that ran along the ocean. You had tribes that lived in the mountains. You had tribes that lived in the desert. But the tribal things ran parallel to the coast according to different ways of living, plains Indians, mountain Indians, that sort of thing. And when they divided the countries up, of course, in Western culture, one of the most important things to do is to have a port, so you can export and import stuff. So when they divided African countries up, they always gave them a port, which is oftentimes you mix several tribes who had no relationship with one another, or worse, had great animosity to one another, and rather than put them all in the same thing. But anyway, so there was a real rise at this point in nationalism, and people began to notice that they were very closely related to one another in culture that was not necessarily the same as the boundaries they had in their country. And there was a movement for the independence of these different cultural units. They wanted to be independent of the country they were in and unite as cultural units. The political makeup of Europe had been a result of history, with very little respect of nationalism. People, took over an area, and they would establish their language in the area, suppress the other language, and stuff like that. So there was no sense of nationalism. Britain, following the Church of England, ruled Ireland. Now, Ireland is a Roman Catholic country, and while England spoke English and Ireland spoke English, the real division was the religion. And so Anglicanism in England and Roman Catholicism in Ireland. And so Ireland never quite came to peace with the relationship with England. They were in a cultural fight while it was going on. The Habsburg Empire ruled Austria, in which the language is really German. It ruled Italy, in which the language is Italian, and it ruled parts of Poland, in which the language was Polish. Hungary and Bohemia were both part of this, and the Hungarians had their own language, and Bohemia, I think, largely spoke French. And all these, each one wanted to be their own separate country, as they have become today. Italian-speaking and German-speaking people were at least united by culture, and were not independent, but were united nations. For instance, if you're going to Italy, it's all sorts of little tiny duchies. So they were united in a sense, but they were independent political entities. Same thing in Germany. Germany was divided into these little tiny political entities. They all spoke German, they had a common culture, but they were independent political entities. The one nation in the world at the time that was closest to an ideal nation actually was France. In the area of France, it was a single thing because the French king, you remember, had taken over it. So France was a single country. They had a single culture, and they had a single language. The effort on the part of people worldwide, had great implications on the Pope, because many people, even strong Catholics, viewed the Pope as a foreign ruler, seeking control of their country. So that if we look historically, the papal states had taken over lots of things in time. They'd taken over the area of Venice at one time. They had taken over several areas, even outside Italy. And I'll tell you how this happened. This would happen if a ruler was dying and he had no male heir, had no one to be heir. He would leave his country to the Pope, because then he knew it wouldn't be invaded or anything, and it would kind of be taken care of. The people would be taken care of. So over a period of time, the Pope owned a lot of areas. He owned part of France. I think if you remember that during the time the popes were gone from Italy, they lived in Avignon, France. But Avignon, France was papal territory at the time, so that they were actually part of the papal states there. So there were some very strong movements at this time also to create national churches. An example of national churches, I'll use the Anglican, but if the Anglican Church, which in England is a Church of England, in Canada is known as the Church of Canada, and in Ireland is known as the Church of Ireland. And it's got this indigenous name in different places. In the United States, they took the name Anglican, and that's what they used. But originally, they were all Church of England. So at this time, realizing that the Church of England was a way of uniting, what they were looking at was churches becoming national, so that, let's say, you would have a French Catholic Church and a German Catholic Church and stuff like this. This has become more evident in our own day with the rise of this use of each country using its own language. Like when I was a youngster, Latin was spoken in all the churches and everything. I had a very interesting experience when I was first, I took a tour of people to, to Russia. And English is basically the only language that I really speak. But in Russia, the Roman Catholic clergy in Russia are from Poland. They're Polish priests. So they speak Polish and Russian. And the only way I could communicate with them was in Latin. And that's because we had both gone through the seminary at the time when that was the church language. But that was a church language anywhere. And you had this ability to kind of communicate with people. So the Catholic Church It wasn't a matter of you came into a Catholic church in Germany and everyone spoke French. They didn't. They spoke Latin. So this idea of the church was kind of prevented from going through this that other churches went through. There were strong movements to create these national churches. Officials thought that the life of the church should fit in with the needs and the practices of the government. And after Vatican II, one of the things they decided was that more of the culture of people should be influencing the church. But notice, this is not the culture and the needs of the government. It's the culture and needs of the people. And that began to be seen as much more important within the church itself. For many centuries, in many European countries, the church had legal power over certain aspects of the people's lives. I give you an example. In the United States, again, we have a unique system that started here, but in the United States, as a Roman Catholic priest, if two people come to me, I can perform their marriage and they are married, okay? But if those same two people go to a Lutheran minister, they are in fact married. Those same two people go in to see a justice of the peace, they are in fact married. We're all empowered to do that. But at this time in history, it wasn't that way. At this time in history, you didn't have a birth certificate. You had a baptismal certificate. And so the church had governance over citizens, okay? When you got married, the state did not do the marriage. The church did. So the church had governance over marriages. And what we would see as church law with regards to marriage and divorce and everything applied nationally at that time. And if you were to go into Denmark, for instance, it would be the Lutheran church. But I don't know if it's still true today, but in my own lifetime as a young man, I knew that in certain countries, wasn't Germany, but it might have been Sweden and Denmark, that in order to be a citizen, you had to be baptized in a Lutheran church. They called Reformed churches there. So baptisms took place there, and then you were received into the Catholic Church. But you had to be baptized there, and you had to have a marriage there, or you weren't married. And so the governance was still there. But anyway, so it had great power over certain aspects of people's lives. Governments were particularly concerned about the church's control over marriage and education, okay? So public processions, clerical dress in public, and particularly the tax-exempt status of the church were opposed by many governments. So governments did not want priests to wear clerical garb. When I was a youngster, it was against the law to wear clerical garb on the street in Mexico. You could wear it in the church. Priests could wear a collar, but you didn't wear a collar on the street. It wasn't done. And this idea, of course, the tax-exempt status of the church. One of the problems with tax-exempt status of the church is the acquiring of property. That the church acquires property, and I think you know, if you have a piece of property, you aren't doing anything with it and this sort of thing, and you don't have to pay taxes on it, you could keep it forever. And the church accumulated property that way. See, that's not true now. If you come into an area like the mission, the area of land underneath the mission, underneath the church itself, is tax exempt. The rest of the property isn't. If you have a school is tax exempt, okay? Playground and everything, a school is tax exempt. But you can't have a piece of property that is tax exempt as a church anymore. But because they did, the churches accumulated massive amounts of property. And so this became a problem. Many governments were very concerned about this. Both Protestant and Catholic districts reacted badly to the efforts to separate the church and the state, okay? So if we were in a Lutheran area, we would react badly as Lutherans to the government's efforts with regards to the Lutheran Church. We wouldn't care less what the government did to Catholic churches. If we were in a Catholic area, the reverse would be true. We would be very concerned about the government's interaction with the Catholic Church, but we wouldn't care about the Lutheran Church. And so this became a very big problem because the larger denominations, Catholic, Lutheran, Calvinist, Anglican, believed that religion was a public rather than a private matter. And so, big public processions, all kinds of things, that religion was a public matter. I saw an example of this when I was in Spreckles, for instance. Spreckles is a little tiny town, but in that town, religion was considered a public matter. An example would be, we used to have Stations of the Cross on Good Friday, and we would go around and do it around the town at different houses where they would set up a station at the house, and we'd do it, this sort of thing. But when we did it, the police stopped traffic, and traffic was routed away from where we were moving and stuff like that. And when you had special Easter processions by the Lutherans, same thing. So that whatever was the religion thing was considered public. It was dealt with by the police and everything, taken care of. And with the growth of liberal and nationalist views in parliamentary governments, many wondered if they should form their own party, while some thought that they should take part in the new parties and bring Christian influences there. So as the liberal movements came, you began to see political parties form. And this is going to be the beginning of the end of monarchies. But you begin to see these political parties kind of form, and we'll go into a parliamentary government over a period of time. But these political movements, let's say in Germany, the political movements were neither Catholic nor Lutheran. And they began to wonder, should we form a Catholic party? Should we form a Lutheran party? Or should we go into these existing parties and bring our principles and stuff into them? Okay, how would that work? And again, you could take something like a Protestant-Catholic divide is the attitude to divorce. Like divorce is readily permitted in most Protestant denominations. In the Catholic Church, you have a huge process of annulment and everything to permit remarriage. So depending on whether the what do you want to call it, the influence was Catholic or Lutheran would affect the whole nation's effect on divorce and remarriage and that sort of thing. So these became very, very important things as to whether they would bring the influences there. Things were very different in the United States, actually, where all faiths were starting even, something that was not possible in older countries with their histories of religious conflict. So as an example, when we came to the United States as Catholics, and Lutherans came, Presbyterians, Baptists, when we came, we were all accepted as independent from the government. The government was not going to support us, and the government was not going to persecute us. Each one was independent and this sort of thing. And the reason was there was no, established religion here at all. If you go into Italy, it was a hard-fought thing for Lutherans, Baptists, Methodists to be accepted as equal, because for so long the only thing had been Catholic. If you were in sections of Germany, same thing with the Lutherans. It was a hard-fought thing for this. And we're going to find out when we go on later, probably the hardest fought thing was Catholics in, England. Catholics in England had no political rights at all up until rather recently. So it was in fact, I think within the past 10 years, two changes in English law are, number one, that the eldest child, not necessarily the eldest daughter, becomes the ruler of the country, and secondly, a Catholic can be ruler. It used to be that wasn't possible, okay, that a Catholic Catholic couldn't do it. In fact, you may well remember when Tony Blair was Prime Minister of England, he basically had converted to Catholicism, but he didn't officially enter the church till after he gave up his job and retired. So in the United States, then, there was no problem with this. The American bishops supported the Constitution, and they wanted independence from the state and freedom to practice the faith. I want you to know that Rome did not want that. Rome wanted the bishops and the Catholics to work to make this a Catholic country. And only over a period of time did they discover that the even playing field is actually better for the church than anything else. In 1870, Italy was united as a result of a revolutionary war, and the papal states ceased to exist. So Italy was finally united. All these little states were brought together. King Victor Emmanuel II became king, and he moved into the papal palace, the Quirinal, and the Pope retreated to the Vatican, okay? So if you visit Rome today, I think the Quirinal is probably the official offices for the city of Rome, but when Italy was united, that was the papal palace. They have a wonderful art collection, which was the art collection of the Pope there at the time. The government offered to pay the Pope a sum of money each year, but the Pope refused to have any dealings with the government. So the government was going to give the Pope a stipend for all the lands, everything that were taken, to help in his support. And what the Pope said, he personally would not recognize Italy as a government. That would not be recognized as a government. And if he didn't recognize it, he couldn't have any dealings with it. So he simply did that. In 1874, the Pope issued a letter forbidding Catholics to be involved in the government in Italy. Okay, remember we discussed how much religious people should influence political parties? Well, now, Catholics were a majority in Italy, and the majority was forbidden to be involved in the elections or anything. They were to have nothing to do with the politics in Italy. Later, under Pope Pius XI, the Italian government and the papacy came to an agreement that created Vatican City as an independent state in 1929, okay? So Vatican City was made an independent state. Mussolini entered this treaty with the Pope, and it's a very small area. There are several churches, as well as the Castel Gandolfo, which is on Lake Como, which are all part of the papal territories. But basically, it's the city-state in the Vatican to keep that independence. But that's almost 100 years after Victor Emmanuel took over all this. The 1800s was a period of great growth for religious orders, taking over the social and charitable works of the church. The church had been done, the charitable works had been done. We talked earlier about some very, very important individuals who rose up in society and would take over doing charitable works at one time or another. Vincent de Paul doing one. Many of them founded religious orders to carry on their work. But the charitable work had not been systematically taken over. At this point, religious orders began to take it over. When I entered the seminary, one of the peculiarities in San Diego was that when the seminary was founded, it was very important to the diocese that it was not under a religious order. Now, in fact, almost all our professors were Jesuit, but the administration of the seminary, that was all under diocesan priests, monsignors, and they were in charge, and over a period of time they took over many teaching positions and stuff. But At this point in history, religious orders began to take over, and they would largely, form the seminaries. Like, for instance, the Diocese of Monterey. If the students from Monterey go to San Francisco, for instance, they used to be under the Sulpicians, which was a religious order dedicated simply to educating priests. But now that is under the Diocese of San Francisco. If they went to study at Mount Angel, that's a Benedictine monastery. So it's under the Benedictines, but they would be priests here. If they were to study in LA, again, it's under diocesan priests. But at this point, there was a great move. Religious orders were growing, and religious orders really needed a job. And so the religious orders took over jobs. They weren't just contemplative orders now. They took over jobs. And the two major jobs they took over were charitable work. You'll find them in hospitals and that sort of thing. The other thing is education, universities and schools. Now we're going to talk about a couple of the people here. John Bosco came from a poor peasant family, and while he knew what it was to be poor, he had no idea of the problems connected to poverty in the cities. See, if you're really poor, there is a huge difference between being poor in the country and being poor in a city. And I would cite my own case that my family initially was, I would say, kind of lower middle class, but where we lived in Pacific Beach in San Diego was a new division that was started. My parents actually got the first house there. And when we were there, if you were to look at an area of 70 acres, there may be 10 houses there. A movie theater, a grocery store, stuff like that. And so very, very few things there. Well, the fact that we didn't have a lot of money was not a big deal. We were living on a beach. And so we had the run of the beach, had the whole area around and that sort of thing. And if you're poor in the countryside, that all kinds of recreation is available to you, and at the same time, you never went hungry. Okay, that was not the issue at all. But if you were poor in a city, not only were there very few things that children could do, they would oftentimes be hired into doing work because their family would need the money to survive. And there was, if you wanted to recreate, you had to pay to go in a pool. I didn't have to pay to go in the ocean. You had to pay to go out on a field to play and stuff like that. It was very, very terrible for people in the cities if they were poor. And John Bosco, coming from a poor family, didn't encounter the dangers of this until he moved into the city. In the seminary, he visited prisons and made friends with many delinquents and criminals. One of the great wonders of John Bosco, he's, for instance, if you want to be a priest, John Bosco is one of the people you have to study. And he had this ability, he had a great sense of humor, and he had this ability to make friends with everyone, and he dealt with everyone as though they were an equal. He didn't, deal as though, well, I'm coming in to help you in the prison, that sort of thing. That he dealt with them as equals. He had an amazing power over people. He gathered them on Sundays for prayers and had a remarkable gift for making friends. He decided to devote himself to young people on the verge of getting into serious trouble. And this probably came from his talking to people. One of the things that struck me when I was working in prison, I used to teach scripture in the prison once a week. And one of the things that struck me is when I sat down and talked to them, many of them had a life very similar to my own. And I'll give you an example that when I was a little boy, one time I went into I think it was a grocery store, it might have been a drugstore, I don't know, but I stole a bar of candy. And when I stole a bar of candy, I was caught stealing it. Now, we're in a little tiny town, Pacific Beach. The man who caught me stealing it never said anything to me at all. He phoned my mother. Now, I met people in the prison, lifelong criminals, who the very first thing that happened to them was they were caught stealing something out of a store, and they phoned the police. And when they phoned the police, you know, the kid, depending on what goes on, could end up in something like the juvenile hall. And if you're in juvenile hall, you learn to steal more important things better. And they just watch them on the thing. And so John Bosco realized that keeping people out of a life of crime means intervening at the first time they have trouble with the law, intervening at that point. And so this is what he saw this. He attracted crowds of children with magic tricks and juggling, and then teaching them about the gospel message. So what he would do is take these, what we would call street urchins, children who lived on the street. They're the ones that are prime set to end up pickpockets and that sort of thing. So he would gather them and he would educate them. He'd educate them in Christian morals and that sort of thing. He established an oratory in Turin, Italy, and provided housing and education for boys at risk. So when he found these kids, he brought them into the home, and he was educating them, he was entertaining them, making friends with them, and this sort of thing. The civil authorities, unfortunately, were very suspicious of the oratory, wondering what the man was doing with all these juvenile delinquents. In time, they would discover that he was changing their entire lives. He was giving them respect, food, love, shelter, and training them in different trades. At the time of his death, there were over 700 boys in his schools, and the work had spread to many other countries. When I was in the Philippines, I found that the very best schools were the schools run by the Salesians. John Bosco did not name his community after himself. He named it after another priest, a bishop actually. I forget the bishop's name, but anyway, they're called the Salesians. It's a form of the priest's name. And what they did, they trained them in crafts and stuff like that. And most people who went to school were going into academia, but he didn't do that. He trained these kids in crafts and built their lives up. The schools that I saw in the Salesian schools that I saw in the Philippines were the very best schools in the entire country. And if your parents were poor, you could go there for free. If your parents were rich, you had to pay what you could to go there on a sliding scale. And they used the money from the richer students to support the poorer students. But as a matter of fact, I don't care how much money you had, you couldn't get in a better school. So their schools were packed all over the Philippines. And another thing I'll tell you about the Salesians had very, very few instances when the pre-scandals were going on about the abuse of children. And you think of them, that they dealt with children specifically. That's what they did, boys. Later on, there were schools. There was a Salesian order of nuns founded that did the same type of work with girls. And so they did that. But initially, it was just boys. And they did just a remarkable job. I don't think we've studied Angela McCurry yet, but Angela McCurry founded the first religious order of nuns that actually went outside the convents and this sort of thing. But one of the things she told the girls that she was bringing in the convent, the nuns, she said, you must treat the students as though they're your children, not your students. And they did the same thing in the Salesians. John Bosco said, you must treat the students as though they are your children. And if you taught history, let's say, to the students in a Salesian school. You would be expected to play sports with the students when they were out there. You would be expected to have lunch out with the students, not in a faculty dining room. That they really mixed and became involved with the students and greatly affected their lives. That it is not possible to overemphasize the effect of John Bosco on the education of young men in the Catholic Church. In 1864, Solferno was a town in northern Italy that was the site of one of the worst battles in history. There were over 40,000 killed and wounded. The newly built railroad was able to bring troops to the battlefield on both sides as fast as they were killed. And there was a desperate lack of doctors, medicine, food, and water. If you were to study like some of the major battles during the Civil War in the United States, you'd see the same thing. There was very little care for people on the battlefield, and just horrible things went on. There was a man, Jean Durant, who was a Swiss soldier who had survived the battle. So he fought in the battle, and he survived. He was a Calvinist, and he began to urge the Swiss government to establish an organization to help the victims of war. Now, the victims of war, he's thinking of physical injuries. Now, the victims of war could be, civilians, as well as soldiers. But that's what he's looking at, the people suffering that way. And this led to the very first Geneva Convention. You probably know the Geneva Convention is an ongoing established thing. Probably where most of us have encountered it is if you get on an airplane, you get a notification that it's governed by the Geneva Convention as to what they have to do for you if certain things go wrong and how they have to be responsible for your luggage and that sort of thing. But those laws are all made by the Geneva Convention. They govern the whole world. 12 of the member nations signed the agreement. Okay, so 12 nations signed the first agreement. Medical staffs were to be considered neutral. Sick and wounded were to be treated humanely, and civilians were to be protected. Now, you see what we see is the beginning today of rules of war. Like there were no rules in the past. When you went into a city, it didn't matter whether the people were on your side or the other side. You looted the city, you killed, you raped, all this sort of thing. And this is the beginning of rules of war. And even in our own day, a lot of times they are not observed, but at least they're there. And they weren't there previously. Over a period of time, hopefully, I hate to say it in that term, but hopefully war becomes more civilized. The emblem of the new organization was to be worn by all members. Okay, so they were to wear the emblem. And because Durant was the one who founded it, and he was Swiss, what they did was take the Swiss flag and inverted it. I don't know if you know, the Swiss flag is a red flag with a white cross. And so they became the Red Cross. And that became that organization. And they served, throughout the world. It's an international organization. Member associations grew up all over the world, and the International Red Cross became the governing body. The Geneva Convention saw many changes over the years, and it now serves in earthquakes, floods, and has become probably the best-known organization in the world. Durant shared the very first Nobel Peace Prize. He got the very first Nobel Peace Prize, and what he left behind was the organization that we know as the Red Cross. In 1870, Prussia was led by Otto von Bismarck and gradually increased his territories, uniting the German-speaking areas. Now see, we see the nationalism rising. So he was taking over German-speaking areas. William I of Prussia was proclaimed Emperor of Germany which was a confederation of many of these small principalities. In this new arrangement, Catholics were now a minority. Okay? Remember, Germany at the time of the Reformation, at the end, they came to this final agreement called the Cuius Regis. So if your prince was Catholic, you were a Catholic area. If your prince was Lutheran, you were a Lutheran area. But once you began to put those all together, there were more Lutheran areas than Catholic areas. And so once they were all put together, the Catholics became a minority. And there was suspicion of the Catholic Church and open hostility. It's the whole idea, again, that are the Catholics more loyal to the Pope than they are to the government? So that became the issue. In 1870, the Catholic community formed the Center Party to represent the interests of Catholics. So the Catholics felt they weren't being represented, so they formed their own political party. And at the time of the rise of the Nazis in Germany, it was called the Catholic Centralist Party. But initially it was just called the Center Party. This was seen as a threat to the German Empire by a foreign power, the Pope. So the Emperor, Emperor William I began to see it as a threat. This period also saw a great flowering of Protestant theology. It's one of the really interesting things is that, like, when you look at the early history of the Catholic Church, you know, our early history was spent as a period of trying to survive. Once we got our freedom, you began to see a period of great theologians. Well, that's what's going on here in the Protestant community. They have, established themselves. The Catholic Church isn't persecuting them anymore. They have owned independence and stuff. So now there's a great flowering of theologians looking into Protestant theology. This took place largely in German-speaking lands and was greatly influenced by the philosophy of Hegel. Hegel had a philosophy that was very widespread among the Germans. We're going to look at a couple of the names. Frederick Turolok was not an exceptional theologian. However, he was a very powerful preacher. And he had a deep influence on many of the people in Germany. He called for a return to the central teachings of the Christian scriptures and the way Luther understood them. Okay? So he wanted that like, if you look in Luther, the key to Luther is the idea of faith. That this absolute faith in a God who will forgive me, the absolute faith in a God who will save me, the absolute faith, this sort of thing, but this faith that overcomes everything. That's the key to Luther. And that's how Luther understood the Christian scriptures. He understood it in all these things of faith. Catholic tradition understood it much more in terms of what we were called to do. The idea of love your neighbor and forgive people, and that we saw much more of that than we did this basic powerful thing of faith. But Luther really saw the powerful thing of faith. And this movement came to be known as the Awakening. So he was calling people back to the understanding of Luther. And remember, Luther was essentially a theologian. Luther taught theology before he ever began the Reformation and everything. So Luther is essentially a theologian. So they're awakening now to Luther's understanding of the Christian scriptures. David Strauss created a sensation with his book called The Life of Jesus, in which he declared the gospel accounts were unreliable legends. Okay? The idea historically is that the gospel accounts were written by Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John, who were eyewitnesses to the events of Jesus and everything. We know today that probably the closest one actually to the events is the gospel account of Mark, and it was probably written at a minimum 30 years after the death of Jesus. You go into the account of John, it may be 100 years after the death of Jesus. And the names of the authors that are on them do not correspond necessarily to the person who actually wrote it down. In fact, one of the interesting things, computers have been very, very helpful in the study of theology. But one of the things is you can put in a computer program, and if 5 of us were to get together and create a paragraph on Luther, we create this paragraph, you could put it into this computer and it would lift out sentences and attribute them to different ones of us. It can pick out that. And as a result of that, we know that there is no gospel account, Mark, Matthew, Luke, or John, that is the work of a single individual. None of them. Okay? So this idea of the thing is the stories are removed from Jesus. The question is, were the stories passed on faithfully, or were they elaborated? You know, it's like, I'm sure George Washington was a very honest man, but the story of this cherry tree, I don't know, okay? And so when we go back, the stories of Washington have been very much elaborated, and that tends to happen to stories. Did that happen to Jesus or not? One of the arguments against it is that the 4 accounts are actually written in 4 different areas. It would be more likely that if they elaborated it, they would all come from one area, or they would be in contact with one another. There are enough differences in the 4 accounts to tell that they were not watching one another when they created their account, okay? That you can tell the way they're going. Matthew and Luke had some reference to Mark, but they added stuff that Mark didn't know about. And John is independent of the others entirely. And so we watch this, and the argument then begins to be, are they authentic or not? And he maintained they weren't. As you can imagine, that was a bombshell. That sort of thing is still a bombshell. I find when I'm teaching scripture courses, very often it's difficult for people to accept the gospel account of Matthew was not written by the Apostle Matthew, but we can't be sure it was. Thank you very much. Pick it up there next week.